Good evening. Welcome to another episode of In Other News. My name is Kurt Maida, and my bespectacled panel here is Erica Adamson, a political analyst, and Gabe Salazar, another political analyst, all locals, and we're going to talk a little bit about what Burlingtonians care about in local, domestic, and international affairs.
Good to be back. So the first topic that we want to go over is just kind of the role of the growing gender divide in U.S. politics. And I was kind of inspired to bring this up when an NBC poll came out in March, just showing the division between college-educated and uneducated men and women in their voting patterns and their perceptions of the current president. And so a poll showed that among white men with no college degrees, President Trump had a plus 41% favorability. He was down negative 38% among white women with a college degree. And as for favorability for Democrats, it is negative 58% among white men with no degrees and negative 4% among white women with college degrees. So I think American men across demographics have shifted to the right. The division is really stronger than ever in my perception, and I kind of wanted to start off with that and kind of discuss why American men and American women are so polarized right now politically.
Thanks, Erica. So, I mean, it's really interesting that you bring this up. I mean, so just to kind of give a little bit of perspective to people watching, there's always been differences in voting patterns between men and women. However, what's fascinating to me as someone who's Gen X is that it's becoming more noted with respect to your generations, Gen Z, and one would think that newer generations have become a little bit more liberal in our culture about social views, and in fact, the opposite is happening. There's a wider disparity between the way Gen Z women vote and Gen Z men vote, much more so than boomers, Gen X folks, and even millennials. So that's really an interesting thing. I mean, I think in part, it seems like the actual issues that men and women care about in Gen Z are different. The priorities are different. I mean, what do you think, Gabe?
Yeah, I think the recent views of, I think, as Erica mentioned, how they're approaching these issues, these demographic splits, is really becoming more apparent, though, in terms of political factions. So Democratic men, how they would view the issues purported by Democrats, whether it be taxation on the rich, whether it be healthcare or more education, are these views that are appealing to more Democratic men, or statistics that Erica mentioned? Or are they being, neglected? Are they being left out of this discussion for political involvement? On the contrary, why is it that the Trump administration's campaign was so effective in garnering support for their, the statistics that Erica mentioned, for those demographics of men?
Good question. So is the president's message, is it more favorable towards men and addressing men's concerns?
It's definitely a big issue. I mean, just recently we had Roe versus Wade overturned. So there are issues that are, let's say, divisive to gendered issues between men and women, equal pay, between men and women in healthcare, men and women in education. There are issues that are split within the policy lines. So it's difficult to say whether Trump specifically said that he would be supporting of American men. I don't recall his campaign ever specifying that, but he is supportive of things like free speech in a more libertarian sense, without restriction, without consequence. So these are the ideals and values that I think are appealing to the majority of American men.
So why is that more important for men compared to women? Well, I mean, or what do you think?
Right, and it's partially, I think, part of this new cultural trend that we're seeing involving the manosphere, involving something that's appealing to men who are being called, victims, be called neglected and left out of this political discussion as a counter response to feminism, feminist ideas, and feminist policies.
Is there any truth to these allegations?
I would hope so. Recently, the United Nations posted a report given the growing trend of online influencers discussing men's rights issues, men's liberty issues, and they've been mentioning how, these ideas are not just restricted to a small subset, but they're influencing other mainstream ideas. They're influencing how politicians and even leaders will respond to the majority of the population in a way that is not necessarily direct, it's not explicit, but it is indirectly associated with these kinds of values and virtues. So it's a signaling of, I think, the return to the old tradition, the old view of gender dynamics. If you
I know. I mean, Erica and I, before the show, we were talking about, statistically, she's a relatively, new graduate. You're not that far away. I graduated a long time ago, but we're talking about the makeup of the demographics in schools.
Absolutely.
Erica, just graduated from UVM in the past year, and the UVM class now is about 65% women and 35% men. People, in terms of how people identify themselves. Mm-hmm. In law school, it's about 56% men. 56% women and 44% men. And med school, it's about the same. It's about 55 leaning towards women and 45 men. Now, when I went to school myself, when I entered law school, that was the first year that we had achieved parity. I went to Rutgers in New Jersey, that the school had achieved parity. And everyone was really celebrating that, that women, made up 50% of the class. And prior to that, it was much lower, and you go back 10, 15 years before I went to law school, and it was significantly lower. There would be, I think, closer to 20% of the student body was female, and 80% male. And now we're seeing, the script kind of being flipped, which, again, it's a tremendous achievement for women to have done that, when you think about the thousands of years, that men and women in society have leaned a certain way in terms of, men being in a superior position in many of these different metrics. It's a great leap in a short period of time, but it seems like in the process, to what you were saying, a lot of men, specifically, and this is where Gen Z comes in, the Gen Z men, not people prior generations, they don't know where they fit in.
Yeah, I mean, I think a strong explanation, or maybe not a strong explanation, but a prominent explanation of why the right is so appealing to young men is that young women across the board, across different, areas, whether it's college or workforce participation or even just mental health outcomes, women tend to be outpacing men, especially for the young generation. And so a lot of people anecdotally seem to believe that the right is appealing to young men because it provides a solution for that. It provides, a counterbalance and addresses the fact that young men have possibly been neglected by the current, order of things.
But is that really true, Erica, or is it that, women have made great strides in what we sort of call, in much of, Western culture, a service-oriented economy?
Yeah.
Where previously in our country's history, you had a large class of blue-collar men getting involved in manufacturing. Mm-hmm. Getting involved in skills that required a lot of physical brawn, physical strength, use of your hands.
Yeah.
And those jobs, many of those jobs either cease to exist or they've gone overseas.
Yeah, I mean, the manufacturing thing is an important point. I mean, with President Trump promising the tariffs to bring back the manufacturing jobs, right. I think that is a very strong reason for why white men, in particular without college degrees, who tended to make up a lot of these manufacturing jobs, ended up wanting him to be the president.
Yeah, and in the process, while this shift has happened with these jobs going overseas as well as or ceasing to exist due to automation, they're kind of sitting on the sidelines. Whereas, women focused on many of these careers that required college degrees and a lot of preparation before going into these fields, they're doing quite well now. Again, I don't want to make viewers think that women have achieved equality and or that they're women still earn less than men do.
Absolutely.
If you look at the tops of most, look at the Fortune 500, okay, and look at who the CEOs are. Look at who sits on the boards. Look at who sits in the cabinet, with the president and higher senior level positions. These are still mostly, and in banking, in the Treasury Department, these are fields that are still completely dominated by men, where big money is. I mean, just to give you like a little bit of anecdotal, personal perspective, so like part of the work I do a lot of immigration work here in Vermont, but I also do a lot of business transactional work where there's a lot of money that's exchanged between parties. I probably over the years probably done close to 1,000 closings going over a period of three decades. In 1,000 closings where there's always an attorney on the other side representing the buyer, the seller, depending on who I'm representing, I'm going to count maybe about 5 female attorneys out of 1,000 when it comes to matters involving big money, power, and control. So these strides are great in terms of what women have done, just even in my professional lifetime, but there's a lot more to go. So I don't want to give viewers the idea that everything's great for women and everything is lousy for men. There's still a ways to go. However, that being said, young men, as I think we have mentioned, are feeling left out. They don't know where they rank, what's a comfortable position for them to be in our society, because gender roles are changing. I mean, What do you guys think?
I mean, generally, I think you could make the argument that young people are more insecure, and a lot of what they're seeing in the media, in social media.
Men and women, or just?
Well, yeah, it's both degrees. But
Okay.
the younger generation, do we have a cultural identity? And I feel like it's a myriad of different messages that the younger generation is receiving.
Right.
And so, there's current problems going on. I mean, there's wealth inequality, certainly no end to violence going on around the world. But
Sure. Yeah.
some of the issues that I think are being raised is more indicative of them just feeling, left out, feling silenced.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up. So like, when I went to school, I mean, everyone trained for a career who,
Right.
that were fortunate enough to go to college or graduate school and assumed that was where they were going to make their income, be compensated. Where I know with a lot of you folks, and I'm sure you have friends, maybe yourselves even, where it's known as a gig economy, right?
Right.
You kind of it's a patchwork of a couple of different kinds of jobs that you're doing, and that you hope is going to pay the bills. All the weight isn't, you're not putting all your eggs into one basket and thinking that's going to pay for your lifestyle, your sustenance.
I would argue that a defining feature of my generation is the perception that we're going to be worse off economically than our parents.
Right. Yeah, you guys are like one of the first generations that are clearly, like in Gen X, it's been discussed, but it's not, I don't think the numbers and the metrics are that clear. But for younger folks like yourselves, that seems to be the clear indication that you're not going to have these sweet fat pensions that your parents had, where essentially you get to retire and you live on something close to your full income, and then you tack on Social Security, and you're kind of doing okay. A lot of those kinds of benefits and things, they don't exist anymore. A lot of jobs don't offer health insurance. So I mean, so there's a certain, for men and women, there's that insecurity that you're talking about.
Right.
However, it seems though, despite that, the outcomes are different for men and women.
Right.
Young men and women specifically. One of the things we were talking about earlier was that, for the show, was suicide ideations amongst men and women. I think the percentages are quite drastically different. For men, the numbers are 21 men in every 100,000 sample size
Right.
are committing suicide. For women, it's 5. So what's going on? Is it this feeling of being left out, and or is it something? I know Erica referenced the manosphere earlier. Can we talk about a little bit, about what that is?
Like, I think the myth of the male purpose or identity
Yeah.
is very much tied into that suicide rate. When you have a generation of young men who are unable to compete financially with how their parents did, maybe they feel like failures, maybe they feel like they don't live up to that vision, that ideal of the masculine dream. And so that,
Which is what
right,
I mean.
which is that usually, the traditional view of a man should be breadwinner, earns out their own keep,
Right.
person of their own household, etc. And so when you
Despite
fail
the
at
fact that I think in all 3 of our, giving out a little bit of personal information, all 3 of our examples, we both had, I think all 3 of us had working parents, right? Both parents
Right.
were
Yeah.
employed.
Right.
Right. So I never really saw it that way,
Right.
despite being older than you guys. But
Either. Yeah.
Now, I mean, that did change a bit in my own family's history. So
Okay.
it wasn't my mother who really sought out working.
okay.
But financial circumstances changed,
Yeah.
especially after 2008. So things just got different.
Sure, yeah.
That being said, though, I think the identity issue is really what's at critical focus here.
Okay.
Is the definition of like you not being able to again sustain yourself. You don't have any educational opportunities, right?
Right.
Let's say you have no financial means to help yourself get into a college.
Yeah.
It's not cheap. It's definitely not getting cheaper.
No.
Competitiveness in the job market. Are you able to actually get a well-paying, full-time, entry-level job with just a high school education alone?
Right.
Many times, no. And then your dating life. I mean,
Yeah.
these men are probably trying to get out themselves, start families, start dating. Are they having any results? Probably not.
Right.
So this just general, I think, ideal of feeling you're not living up to that male ideal, the male identity.
Okay.
They like these influencers.
You mean that
online.
male identity of this
The
concept
myth.
of like
Let's
head
call
of
it,
household?
Yeah, let's call it
Yeah.
a male myth, sure.
Right, right.
But
Like that.
whatever, it's purported to be. That's what has been passed down along many generations in this country.
Right.
That's like, seems to be like the American standard of how men are to be brought up and to become men.
So
Again,
maybe part of the
I think-
issue right now is that men are in a position like women were in the 60s where women especially a lot of women that were out on the front in terms of protests and burning bras and doing all those kinds of things to try to achieve equal rights, they were helping redefine what femininity was.
Right.
In the 60s. Maybe we're in a position where we sort of have to do that with masculinity. Maybe we thought that was something that didn't need to be touched. Femininity was expanded.
Right.
That you can have a firewoman, you can have a woman in the military, she can be an astronaut, as opposed to just a mom or a couple of limited service professions.
Right.
Like a nurse or something back then. So maybe similarly, men have to kind of expand the definition of masculinity.
Right.
But
And-
there's a contingent that wants to kind of, that's a stubborn contingent that wants to go back to what it was, like you said, when
like
even before
older
maybe
values,
we were born.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I think the statistics you mentioned regarding suicide rate, those are to the United States men, right? That's where the survey was held.
Correct. Yeah, that's
Right.
an American
So international. I mean, there's different values of masculinity around the world,
Yeah.
but what we're, I think, reflecting and trying to see is what is going on with the men in the United States, right? Especially regards political division within politics. So
Right.
they're all, I think, interconnected issues.
Yeah.
The way that men will reflect their political actions is in self, a reflection of their social and their individual values. So.
Right.
Now, to bring the question of like why the manosphere got so
Right, why the
popular,
manosphere?
right.
So, yeah.
I mean, as far as like what we can understand, I think just researching what I could online, the manosphere was a term kind of made up in 2008. So it is a pretty recent idea, the manosphere itself. But the values, again, the counter action against the feminist ideals really did start around the 70s, pretty much the same time as the
So, I mean,
feminist
this is
revolution.
kind of, is it essentially a rejection of feminism?
Yeah.
In terms of like what's being kind of spouted out to young men by a lot of these podcasters, Joe Rogan, then there's, I don't know if he's considered that, but, Theo Vaughn and a lot of these, and a lot of them kind of tend to be right of center, right, in terms of what they're expressing.
Right.
It's interesting. I read that the algorithms are designed in such a manner that, initially when younger men, or maybe, we can even call them adolescents, they express interest in a topic such as, working out, or dating, kind of innocuous, nothing extreme. The algorithms are set up so that you start getting messages from more extremist sites involving otherwise, topics like gaming, exercise, or, dating, things that adolescent boys are interested in. And it kind of seems to be sucking them into this world where there's, a lot of misogyny being espoused.
All of a sudden you're getting content about how your dating life is difficult because of feminism, or you're not able to do well financially because women are taking up the workforce, and they're getting paid too much to do office jobs where they don't do anything. Things like topics like that. It kind of
where previously men were doing those same jobs 2 generations ago, and no one was questioning the validity or the honor, so to speak, of those very same jobs.
All this is to say though that people engage with kind of service level topics, and the algorithm rewards the controversy.
Right.
And it rewards the radical content rather than the safe content that might be more fact-based.
Right. So, on that note, are Democrats too safe, right? I think Democrat ideals are more, again, inclusive, maybe more mainstream for that point.
Yeah.
In that they're not trying to really destroy or usurp any of the things that have been, I think, formally adopted by their party.
Right.
But on the right, I think you have more of that willingness to tear down, to break apart these progressive values that have kind of been lodged into the mainstream since the 70s.
Right.
So,
but Erica was talking about, she was giving us stats about what happened in the last election. So Republicans may be signaling, sending out signals or nods, and fist bumps, showing up at the Super Bowl, showing up to NASCAR, showing up to UFC fights, matches, whatever you want to, however you whatever you call them. I don't mean that in a bad way, but are they really offering solutions to men, or are these just nods? Because on the last episode we talked a lot about Doge, and the extensive cuts that have been implemented by that sort of strange non-governmental body,
right.
And the cuts in many cases were when it came to health outcomes, it involved things like cuts to CDC, to suicide research, to things that could actually potentially help men that are down in the dumps and feeling that kind of pain. So whereas Democrats, those types of pro-social causes, that's something that they've always championed.
Right.
So Republicans, are they really doing something for men, or is this more of a nod and we're going to take our message to the bank kind of thing?
Right. If you want to do that by force, that's what it seems like the Republican Party is doing.
What do you mean by force?
So, whereas again, policies enacted through Congress have been promoting these things, like these studies about men and women divisions, certain health initiatives. These things have been I think enshrined within the Democratic Party's ideals. Again,
Sure.
The right can call them woke, they can call them DEI initiatives,
right.
But at the end of the day, they're trying to expand the realm of inclusivity for science and for the general good.
Right.
The right would rather see that forcibly taken away and to, again, realign it back to the traditional values.
Yeah.
Again, there's any signs of wokeness, even the military executive order that recently removed individuals from trans identity.
Right.
So just the fact that they're forcibly doing this, without any means for an alternative recourse, seems to be like they're not taking any, sides. There's just one. There is one way.
But that's
There's no
that issue
diversity.
itself, though, right? That's sort of a nod to an issue that it appears that more men care about. Ironically, there's all these arguments about trans athletes in what's known as women's sports.
Right.
And I saw the stats. More men are upset about the involvement of trans athletes in women's sports than the women who are actually competing,
right,
in women's sports. You would think like that is, that's who's being affected, right? By this idea that, there's going to be someone who's much physically larger
right,
participating in potentially a full contact sport that could, cause physical harm. But it seems like men care more about that issue than a lot of women, that are actually, in that, involved in those sports.
right.
Yeah. So again, there's a lot of signaling. I guess the biggest thing is the hope that, in terms of the Republicans doing anything concrete, is the potential of bringing this manufacturing base back to the United States and essentially recreating the 50s. I mean, I don't know. Do you guys think that
seems to be the goal?
Right?
Yeah.
Right. But the world's changed. So much of this has
that
gone
ship has sailed a little bit.
What's that?
The ship has sailed a little bit.
Ship has sailed. Folks have this idea that we're going to go right back to the 1950s. Where mom is, cooking lunch, dinner, and and everything else for the week,
right,
and dad goes out and works. But a lot of these jobs have been replaced. People have been replaced by robots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of women would rather, I believe, young women would rather be single for the most part than have to be housewives if they don't want to be.
Yeah, stuck in
Yeah.
relationships where they are,
Which isn't to say that there aren't women who do prefer that, but
Sure.
I think the average woman would be a little bit pickier.
Right.
Is that
rather
what
than
you're
settle for
seeing
that.
amongst female friends, of your generation?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of us would be very comfortable being independent.
Yeah. So that's a big shift.
So that's, yeah.
And I think there's been some resistance to that on the part
Yeah.
of men.
And
right?
again, that's part of the success, I think, of the 70s, the feminist revolution. So
Yeah.
it's been enshrined. Like, you cannot really take away that without force. And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what this administration is trying to do. Do things
And what the
by
manosphere
force.
is trying to do.
Right.
Right, with the
too.
manosphere.
Like,
Right.
I guess, reclaim women by
There's
force.
no voluntariness, right?
Yeah, because there is a dark space, right? It seems like in I don't want to say all of it, but in some of the manosphere that almost advocates violence against women if necessary. We were talking about whether or not this is an American thing or an international thing. I was seeing something that a party that is competitive in Poland, after suffering some electoral losses, they were talking about taking away the right to vote for women.
I see that among like people on the internet based in the U.S. a lot.
That's crazy,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're a little past 100 years since women, female suffrage,
Right.
and we're having those kinds of arguments now.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that Project 2025 said something about 1 vote per household.
Wow.
I totally could be wrong on that, but
Right. Interesting. And again, that whole
we all know what that means.
Right. Yeah, that's code for the male head of household is going to vote, and the woman's views and things are not going to be represented.
Yeah, which isn't to say that I realistically see them making any progress towards that, but it kind of.
But the fact that that's being put out there,
Yeah.
100 years after women, acquired the right to vote in this country, it's really going backwards, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, we don't have that much time yet, but I did want to ask if there's anything that people on the left can really do to win back young men in particular. Some people say that we might need a Joe Rogan of the left. Some people might say, that we need to put up more masculine men to signal to voters that they are welcome as young men to join the Democratic Party. What do you guys think? What could the left be doing right now?
I think one of the things is if there are going to be the Joe Rogan of the left, we've talked about Hassan and a couple of other folks that are kind of making their way up the ranks. I think they do have to acknowledge, I mean, take the misogyny out of the equation, but talk about, young men, going back to school, taking an interest in education. Listen, guys, put away the video games and, set the porno aside and focus the way women have in terms of trying to, in their revolution, in terms of trying to, acquire equality, hit the books, find a trade, do something, that interests you, and to get out there. And I think there also has to be an acknowledgement that there is this pain with respect to, the conversation we had about suicide, which is very serious. And talk about funding mental health, which is so important in this country. I mean, with the amount of gun violence we have in our country, often there's always this shift away from blaming, the gun manufacturers, because even on the right, they'll say, well, this is a mental health crisis. Okay, let's stipulate to that, okay? It's not the guns, it's the mental health crisis, but put some money into, towards helping, young Americans, with their mental health challenges. And in this context, specifically men, younger men that are disproportionately, killing themselves.
All right.
I mean, any...
If I could just kind of tack on to that a little bit. So, I mean, we discussed a little bit of parity, that idea of like we're trying to achieve this, balance. And I don't think it's necessarily that men have to like find something to do that makes them men, but find something that makes them feel like they are part of a group. Whether it's just themselves in community activities,
and
being with friends,
expanding,
right.
the definition of masculinity, just like women did in the '60s in terms of
Absolutely.
femininity.
Right. What it means to be a man doesn't have to be your full-time 40 hour a week worker.
Well, right.
It could mean you're stay-at-home dad, and
Sure.
it could mean that you take care of your kids, and that's all you do, right?
Right. And always being in a dominant position in terms of the household, in terms of dating, in terms of other areas in society.
All right. Well, I mean, yeah, those are I think just the limitations, if you will, put on, self-imposed by a lot of men as to what it means to be a man. And so I think just pushing outside those boundaries, seeing what more you can do to fulfill yourself as a human being, not just a man, but as a human.
Right. And I think, I mean, in the context of dating as well as other areas of, life, I mean, it'll probably wind up paying dividends.
Right.
I mean, we were talking earlier, of societies in Scandinavia that are much more feminist, feminism and feminist oriented than the United States is. And men seem to thrive as well as women in those societies. The happiness quotient that they always, research every year, the happiest countries are countries that happen to have more feminist, ideology as part of the national discussion and the narrative. Right. So it's not a situation where, okay, the fear that you have from the manosphere, the feminists have taken over, our lives are ruined. Their empowerment disempowers us. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's a different, it's another way of thinking.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I do think that the gender roles are harmful for everyone, not just women. Women kind of rejected them in the 60s, and I think it is time for men to reject them as well, which doesn't have to mean that you can't enjoy masculine hobbies or be, I guess, conventionally masculine, like you can be, but I think when people are criticizing toxic masculinity, what they're really criticizing is like the outdated ideas of what it means to be a man that end up hurting everyone. Right, and disproportionately, from a standpoint, hurt women. Yeah. You look at crime statistics. Something like 80 or 85%. I'm sorry, I think it was 88% of violent crimes are unfortunately committed by men. And in excess of 80% of violent crimes that are committed against women are committed not by other women, but by men. Mm-hmm. So, and then of course, then that leads to, disproportionate, incarceration rates for men, which again, that doesn't, do men good in the long term. Right.
But I think neither would we want to achieve parity, so to speak, but we want a reduction altogether of these crimes in the first place.
Of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, there's different ways we could approach these things, but this problem does exist, and I think that's just why we're here talking about it now.
Right, right. So I mean, we're running out of time here. We had 2 other topics. We'll talk about those topics in the future. We're gonna, if you're watching the little piece up here, we were planning on talking about campus, First Amendment rights in campus, free expression, as well as the situation in Ukraine and Russia. However, I think this kind of dominated our discussion. I wanted to end the show with a new concept here. Last week I did a tribute to a friend. This time around, what I want to do is discuss different things that we're following in the news, or in pop culture, in local affairs. So either one of you guys, you can start out, or I can jump in and say something. What are you guys following?
Yeah, so I've been following the petition that was recently signed by 170 different downtown businesses.
Right here in Burlington.
Right here in Burlington.
Yeah.
Regarding kind of improving, I guess, the image of downtown. I know a big thing that they also were advocating for was moving the food distribution out of the parking garage. And so the city council recently passed a resolution kind of defending the businesses and backing that. So it's caused some controversy, but it's all very new, and it's very interesting to see what's gonna come of this. Have you guys been following this?
I heard about it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of outcomes, is that going to solve everything? I mean, because I've heard everything from, on one side of the argument, there aren't enough police, okay? And the last administration, mayoral administration, and the current administration, they're not actively ramping up the hiring of, police officers. But then on the flip side, there is an issue as to whether or not we can just make these problems, disappear. If we're not adequately addressing, the root causes of homelessness, the distribution and consumption of, fentanyl, meth, which are the underlying problems here, without providing treatment, without providing job, security, job training to people that have gone through these difficult, periods in their lives. How do we get out of this problem? We can't make the people just disappear.
Right.
So
It's not something we can solve in 30 seconds, that's for sure.
No, certainly not.
What have you guys been following?
Yeah, no, related to that, the opening up of safe injection sites, which has been met with some back and forth between Burlington city officials. So some would say, to follow the example of Montreal, some say that's an effective use of public funds, prevents people from dying. But then people object to that, saying it's just a space for people to get high, to shoot up. So,
well, what's the advantage of doing that?
well, as they've mentioned, it's preventing people from dying. It's actually being monitored. It's not just like a place where they go just to use the substance, but it's actually where they're being monitored, being observed by medical facilities staff to actually make sure that they're not overdosing and dying on the streets. So, again, it's a new kind of development, and it's trying to mimic what's been successful in Canada and Montreal. So it's trying. Again, that's the current debates going on.
Okay, all right. So one of the trends, I've been following the news is, so the president just came back from a pretty extensive trip through the Middle East. They dropped sanctions that have been applied against Syria for decades. And interestingly, the president did not visit or meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it appears that, a lot of the deals that he struck or attempted to strike were done in his absence. So I'm kind of interested in seeing, what comes about long term. There's also talks going on with Iran, and that's been an issue, a thorn on the American side for decades. And the Iranians would probably say, we've been a thorn on their side for even a longer period of time. But where this goes, I'm not really sure. So that's something that I've been looking at and want to see what happens in the coming weeks.
Right.
So again, I want to thank the panel and thank CCTV for having us, and we'll see you in a month.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Good night.